Believe it or not, this Samurai is kind of a mess. We've got multiple owners with different ideas and multiple iterations of those ideas. So today we need to finish pulling all the drivetrain out, get a really good look of how everything's going to fit in here, and then we can finally get a solid plan forward so we can start reassembling everything permanently. I've got a pile of tube from Barnes 4-wheel drive. We've got a whole bunch of suspension parts and pieces from Barnes 4-wheel drive. So now, before we start the suspension, I want to pull out the engine, trans, and transfer case and see how we need to modify the chassis in order to accept all these new parts. The engine is a little 4-cylinder Volkswagen TDI, which is a diesel, and that's married to the factory Suzuki Samurai transmission. From there, we go through a little drive shaft that then goes to the Suzuki Samurai transfer case that has been geared down to 6:1. The engine that was installed before this one was a really old school Volkswagen turbo diesel, made a lot less like instant power, and I don't think that these parts are going to live up to this engine unless certain things are met. So first we need to pull everything out. I want to see if my plan A is going to work, which is going to be a new transmission, or if we're going to have to go back to plan B, which is going to be gearing everything down super low to make it to where this transmission from the Suzuki Samurai can survive a mildly built TDI. I'm fired up, and it's because I just got off the phone with Ian Johnsson and then with Colt from Bleep and Jeep, and I finally have a plan moving forward. And this was something that I have literally been losing sleep over because I just didn't know exactly how to proceed until like 5 minutes ago. So I had to pull the drivetrain out to get a really good look at this transmission tunnel because I knew it was going to be slightly smaller than what I needed to fit the Jeep transmission, but I really wanted to fit that Jeep transmission. And now that I have pulled everything out, I've got a really good look at it, and I've gotten to pull some measurements and stuff, there's no way this Jeep transmission is gonna work. So what we're gonna do is we're just gonna do a super mild build on the TDI, and then we're gonna run it through that Samurai transmission. It concerns me a little bit, but after talking to Colt and talking to Ian, I've got a little bit more faith in it. And one really big point to make here with that transmission, not only is the transfer case 6:1, so that's going to help pull some of that, drivetrain strain off of the engine and transmission, but our axles are 7.5:1, which is going to pull a ton of the stress and strain off of the engine, transmission, and transfer case. So a lot of that extra torque and all that the extra load that we're going to see whenever these tires are bound up is going to stay here in the strongest part of the vehicle because it's geared so low. So I'm fired up because we finally have a path forward. And what I want to do in this video is I want to get our front double triangulated 4-link figured out. I want to get the rear double triangulated 4-link figured out. And I couldn't do that until I knew exactly how these cross members were going to be. So what the plan is now, I'm going to lift this thing up in the air. I'm going to grab the Sawzall. We're going to start hacking cross members out of our way because we're going to modify them in order to fit the new locations of our drive shafts and all that other stuff. And then we'll have a good starting point to mount all of our bracketry for the new 4-link suspension. The last thing that I want to do is open up this chassis in a way that's going to make it like bow out or in or do anything wonky. We want to keep this as true as how Ian built it whenever he initially put this chassis together. So the plan is to build a temporary cross member that's going to be low slung, and I'm eyeballing it to see. I'm hoping it's going to be too low, to be completely honest with you, but I want it to be low and out of the way, and it's going to have two really meaty tack welds on both sides. And this is going to make it to where we can chop a bunch of these center cross members out of the way, and we can do our fabrication without having as much of a risk of things distorting and tweaking and having this chassis move around too much throughout the fabrication process. It's so difficult in these videos to convey how much work all this stuff is because, I don't know, it's difficult to like shoot yourself while you're just grinding and cutting, and then also you do too much of that, people just get tired of watching you grinding and cutting. But that was a few days worth of work to get everything cleaned off, to decide where I want to mount all these different things. And now we're finally at a point where I can explain what my idea is to build out this front suspension. So you've seen in the past where I've done a single triangulated suspension style. So we've got our axle here, these are 2 front tires, or rear tires, whatever. And then this is chassis components right here. The red links are uppers, the green links are lowers. And I did this style rear suspension on my TJ. I did this style rear suspension on my Land Rover, and I like it because it's just clean packaging if you can get everything to fit. Now, the big benefit of this style, if instead of just doing like basically a parallel 4-link with a panhard bar, is you can get rid of the panhard bar. Because of like fuel tank placement and all this other stuff, it might be really hard to package a panhard bar. And so that's why I like this. Ideally, you want to go more of an orientation like this, a double triangulated 4-link, because you get some flex steer with a single triangulated 4-link. So we just have a triangulated upper, 2 parallel lowers, and what that does is whenever you've got the wheels traveling up and down, and they're at the extreme parts of the travel, the axle actually swings side to side as it's going up and down. And this will make the rear end of the vehicle steer a little bit as it's flexing. Some vehicles, it's a big deal. Other vehicles, it's not a big deal. The cool thing about it being a 2-buggy is that we have a lot more flexibility of the placement of all this stuff. So packaging constraints are a little bit less of an issue, but they're still an issue. So ideally, we'd want something nice and tight like this. And I'm 99% sure we can build a traditional double triangulated 4-link in the rear that's going to be just like this. The arms are nice and tight. There's tons of triangulation, and this is ideal. This is what we have to work with because right in here, we've got an engine, and like all 4 links would try to hit the engine if we try to do it in this orientation, or we'd have to lift the Samurai up even higher than it already is. So our front suspension looks a lot closer to this. We've got the upper links, we've got the lower links mounted on the inside of the frame rail on the lowest part, and then the upper links, we basically built a new chassis member to mount to. And they basically turn into sliders on the outside. But remember, this is a 2-buggy. There's no such thing as sliders or bumpers or any of that stuff. This is literally just one big chassis that has all these different parts and pieces that have multiple jobs. So this is like completely normal to mount things in this orientation where even though it looks like it's a slider, it's a 2-buggy. Race cars do the same thing. So I wouldn't build suspension components into sliders on something like, that's a streetable, a JK or my wife's Gladiator or something. But in this instance, this is going to help us out a lot. So this extra chassis member that we built is going to get a bunch of other stuff mounted into it that's going to make it super rigid, super firm. And because we've got this engine in the middle here, we had to move those upper links somewhere if we want to do a double triangulated 4-link. This doesn't have a whole lot of triangulation, but because we're going full hydro and the tires are going to be steered from the axle instead of steered from a point on the chassis, I don't think we're going to have any weird body roll characteristics. I think that this is going to work just fine, but you don't know until you build it out. So now what we're going to do is we're going to chop and clean the front axle, get it all prepped so we can start tacking some different brackets into place, and then we can cut and weld and build out our links. The plan is to use a double-ended steering ram on the front of this axle. Right now, the steering goes behind the axle, which is really nice, and it's tied together with a tie rod, but that's going to get in the way of our lower links. So just for right now, we're going to unbolt the steering arms. We're going to reverse it to where the tie rod is in the front, and this is just to temporarily free up space in the rear, but also making it to where these 2 front tires are tied together, and we can still roll this around the garage somewhat easy. The front axle is dialed in. It is exactly where I want it. And the way that I do this, I don't know how other people do this, but the way that I do it is I make a mark on the floor that correlates perfectly with the center line of our chassis. So I have a dot laser. You could do this with a plumb bob. I go from the center line of one frame rail, make a mark onto the floor. Center line of the other frame rail, make a mark on the floor. I pull a measurement between those 2 points. It's 27 inches. Half of 27 inches is the center line of the chassis. And because the dot laser is auto leveling and everything, it is extremely precise. So I do the same thing in the rear. Then I take a chalk line. I run a chalk line from the front point to the rear point. I cast a line on the floor. I paint over it with clear spray paint. And now I have a semi-permanent mark on the floor. Once the project's all done, I just take a little brake clean and a rag. It all wipes right up. But until then, I can sweep over this, I can walk on it, whatever, and I have this constant centerline measurement that I can pull measurements from. And it makes it to where it's super fast with the line laser, which I use all the time for fab in the shop, because I can just run a line across. I basically just mirror it on top of, I cast it on top of this line on the floor, and then it makes it to where I can line up axles and whatnot. And the way that I got the axle center line, pull from one common point to the other, divide that in half, make a center line, and now all I have to do is make sure that as I'm moving this axle around, I make sure that this line from the laser is casting over the line that I made for the center line of the axle, and this is now perfectly centered in the chassis.
The original plan was to use these upper control arm towers from Barnes 4-wheel drive, because I've used these on many projects in the past, but once I started to fit everything up, and the more I saw the amount of inches of weld, I changed my mind. I think that there is a lot more stress on your upper control arms whenever you have portal boxes like this, and I don't want to risk having some sort of a situation where the front end really gets bound up and I got to be really hard on it, and then I rip off these upper control arm mounts. I think that it would be smarter for me to build an upper control arm mount system that's going to tie into our front steering system, and then because it's all one cohesive unit, we have way more inches of weld between our brackets and the housing, and I think that long term that's going to give us the most durable option.
For those of you that don't know, in rock crawling competitions, a lot of guys use suck down winches. So a lot of times it's just your normal winch. You just run it straight down to the axle, and it makes it to where if the suspension starts to unload when you're going up something, you can use the winch to compress that suspension, and then, I don't know. In theory, it'll make it work better, but personally, I haven't seen it make much of a difference. If someone's trying an obstacle and then they suck down the front end, I haven't seen like this giant difference in success. But I do want to incorporate that into this build because this is a full-on rock buggy, And I do want to have that flexibility, and then I can experiment with it and make that decision for myself of whether or not it is something worth doing. Now, unfortunately, until I get my double-ended ram, I can't continue on this truss because I want to incorporate this truss like into the double-ended ram, and then we'll fill this in with a bunch of webbing with dimple dies. It's going to look amazing, but I need to wait. It's tempting to just build a big steering ram mount without the ram here, and I've done that kind of thing before, and it's completely blown up in my face. So what we're going to do is we're going to chop the whole front end off. This will not accommodate what I want to do with the Samurai because I want to put a radiator up here instead of the back seat, and I want to put a full-size Samurai hood, which I do have back there, and I bought a JDM spec Suzuki Jimny front grille that I think looks super dope. So at some point in the next couple weeks, we'll be chopping and narrowing that to fit the profile of this Samurai buggy.
I changed my mind. I think that the best way to move forward is to modify the grille, mount the hood, and then we know exactly how to build our new front end.
I want to be able to unbolt the whole front of the Samurai down the line. I think that it's going to make it easier, but first off, we're going to box the crap out of this whole thing to make the front of the Samurai super strong, because we're going to have a winch on the front. That puts a lot of stress and strain if you just have like 2 1 3/4 frame rails. So we need to box this in and tie in a bunch of tube to make it rigid, but that also makes it difficult to get an engine in and out of here. So what I'd like to do is make it to where we can unbolt the whole front end later on down the line, because for future repairs, it just might make it easier to be able to unbolt everything off of the front. So I'm thinking that we use these tube couplings that I got from Barnes, and we tie this into our frame rails. I just got to make sure that our first 2 bends are like exactly where we need them, and that these tubes line up exactly where we want them, because this foundation for these first couple of bends and these first couple of welds is going to set the tone of accuracy for the whole rest of the front of this. So I'm seeing like, I don't know, not quite a 45. I bet you this is like a 35-degree angle or something. I want to make it to where the tube comes up nice and high so we have lots of clearance for the upper part of these control arm mounts. We'll see. Hopefully we just do this once. This is one of those things where it's so important that if we have to tack a few different ways to do this together a couple different times, it's worth it in the long run. But right now, I'm seeing this tube coming up, doing a slight bend up nice and high to give us clearance here. And then hopefully that XJ radiator will still fit in here. We just won't know until we start tacking tube together and bending stuff up.
I'm not an expert chassis builder or anything like that, so you're gonna see me use a lot of like construction techniques to build stuff. And this line laser, for me, is such an important tool, and I used this for so many years on so many commercial job sites, and it makes my life so much easier. So naturally, I fall back on something that just, for me, is old reliable. I can whip out this line laser, I can run it across our center line measurement, and now we have a common point for me to continuously recheck both of these frame rails to make sure that everything is completely true with the rest of the chassis and everything is completely square. And I'm gonna pull tons of measurements to make sure that the body is level and that the hood is level, and I'm gonna do whatever it takes to make this as square as possible. I can't stress enough how important it is that the front of this Samurai matches the rest of it. This is gonna be a building block for so many more parts and components and pieces to mount onto, and I don't want anyone to look at this in the future and think that somebody did it in their backyard, even though that's what's going on here. I want them to look at it and think, wow, this was done very well and very professional and to a really good degree of accuracy. That is the goal, and that's what I'm hoping to achieve here.
What do you guys think? I like it. I think the JDM grill is, I mean, it's just a really nice little cherry on top. I've got lots of little ideas for some things like that we can do to really make the Samurai stand out in the future. But so far, I'm liking the progress we made. We've got suspension. The suspension might change a little bit. As I work on this in the coming weeks, I might decide to move a bracket or maybe even lengthen this a little bit more. But, you know, right now it's in there. And we're making forward progress, and I think at a really good rate. Now, wins. We've got the grill, I think was a huge win. Losses. This is a loss. I was hoping to mount the winch because we're going to use the winch off my TJ. This is a really nice, small, super lightweight winch. And I was going to use this behind the grill. But once I just kind of set the motor in there and started looking at the space I was going to have for a radiator or whatnot, I think that I'm going to be competing for space a little too much. So the good thing is I cut these tubes longer than I needed, and that is going to give us a platform to build a winch. Now for this, we're gonna have to move this. So I'm gonna chop the top part of this. This is gonna end up just being a really nice, like, keyed center mount for the upper truss. And then we're gonna have to move something like this onto our steering ram mount that we build. And then that'll end up being like right underneath our winch, and we'll be able to do the suck down thing whenever we're going out and hitting the hard rocks. Here's a part of the video where maybe you could help me. I need somebody's help. I need to either make a special adapter to go into a Midnight Metalworks transfer case, or I need to find another transmission that's similar in size to the Samurai transmission that it can go in one of these trans tunnels without having to modify the crap out of the trans tunnel. So if you are a Samurai expert and there's another transmission I should be looking at, please let me know. Otherwise, what I need is one of you guys with an old blown up Jeep transmission, like an AW4 or AX15, something that's a 23 spline output. I just need to buy a cheap transmission that I could tear apart and chop that 23 spline output so we can make a special adapter to go into the Midnight Metalworks transfer case. I really want to use a heavy duty aftermarket transfer case so we can do front digs. It's also going to be way stronger, and the aftermarket cases like that are compact, they're ultra strong, and I mean, so many more options when you look at aftermarket cases like that. So one way or another, just let me know. Do I need to get another transmission, or is there another transmission option available, I guess I should say? Or do you have access to a 23 spline stub that we can use to make a special Samurai flange by 23 spline stub adapter to go into that case, and then we can go from the Samurai trans to that case. In any case, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you guys think of the project. I'm very excited about it, and I hope you are too.